Hey friends, I'm excited for this third week of Welcome to Your Story. We're going to read from Romans 5. I'd invite you to turn there, the first 5 verses. Therefore, since we're justified through faith, we have peace with God through Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand. And we boast in our hope of sharing in the glory of God. And not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. May God add blessing to our reading and understanding of these words. So I remember when I got my first apartment, when I was all out on my own for the very first time. I was in grad school. It was my last year, my third year, and I was back in Chicago to finish my grad school career. I'd lived in a dorm on campus my first year, and then my second year, I lived sort of around the country and around the world abroad a little bit. And so I was settling into this final year of school back in Chicago, and I knew a few things. It was going to be an absolutely jam-packed year. I was going to have a ton of theology and writing and reading, and also had a lot of stuff going on at where I was working. And so all of that was happening, and I knew I wanted to have a nest, a place to land, and it was going to be my very first place all on my own. Do you remember your first apartment or your first house? Anyway, it was all so exciting, at least until I took the first steps in my apartment. It was a second-story apartment, perfectly situated between my 3 best friends' apartments, literally one across the street, one down here, one over here. And I could stick out my head and see all of them, and I could yell to all of them, and I know that because I verified it. They also told me that when Salvador Perez hit his single down the left field line to win the wild card game in 2014, they could all hear me screaming in my apartment. So that's how close we were. I was perfectly situated. Everything was great. It was really good. And so I was in these school-owned apartments. I was allowed to move in the week before Labor Day. Classes started right after Labor Day, and I was coming off of a busy summer living abroad, and I had stashed all my stuff in my adoptive family's house in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. So I was ready to get in and to get settled and to get ready for the year that was to come. But there was one problem, and it was the floor. Now, at first glance, the floor looked fine. It's what you'd expect out of a building that was probably, 60, 70 years old. It was those little 1 foot by 1 foot linoleum tiles, and they were the ones that were mostly white, at least at one time, with faint colors, specks in them. They appeared to be fine. They stuck to the floor just fine, but here was the problem. When you walked on them, you also stuck to the floor. You know what I'm saying? And it's not like, there was that sound sometimes you get when you stick to the floor. It wasn't just that. I mean, you had that, but it was actually more work. Like you were sticking so hard that you had to pull your foot up harder. That's what I'm talking about. And it was so bad that if you had your shoes off, but your socks on, I kid you not, the floor would pull your socks off. That is a real story. That is the apartment that I moved into. And so I called the maintenance folks and the housing folks on campus. I got the runaround, and when I finally got an answer, it was Thursday of the week before Labor Day, and they said, guess what? It's a long weekend coming up. We're not going to be able to look at it until next week, until after the holiday weekend, until after classes had started, until after my only chance to move in, let alone get settled, had passed. And so I was pretty upset, to say the very least. So I made my way to a local store and bought every cleaning product that I thought might possibly fix whatever was the problem with this floor. And I tried all of them twice, and none of them did anything except for one thing. One thing worked. A magic eraser. Now, these are aptly named magic erasers. This is not a commercial for them. I'm not endorsed, but I'm telling you, they do unbelievable things. And here's the deal. That was the only thing that would clean the floor. Now, I'm not even sure if it was worth it, because it required me getting on my hands and knees and cleaning every single one of those 1 square foot tiles in my apartment, 600 of them approximately, give or take, hands and knees. And not just like oh, that's it. No, scrubbing each one of them. I cannot tell you how many magic erasers were sacrificed at the altar of that floor. I can't tell you how many hours I spent on my hands and knees in that barely air-conditioned apartment that I had. I can't tell you how many unpastoral words I said, that the sort of language that I used that was as colorful as the specks on those tiles, nor can I tell you how many curses I called upon the housing department of my school while I was doing it. All I can say is that begrudgingly and angrily and exhaustedly, I did every single tile one by one in that entire apartment. And to this day, my three best friends who I could stick my head at and yell at, they still laugh mostly at me, sometimes with me if I'm in a really good mood, about this particular story, even though we live in different parts across the country. And most times that I see one of them, I can almost be certain that there will be a gift of a magic eraser when we see each other. Sometimes I even get one in the mail or a package of them. I get it in the mail and I don't get a return address, but I always know where it comes from. Friends, today we're talking about conflict. And conflict at its core is really quite simple of a concept. Don't overcomplicate it. It's simply a gap. And here's what I mean. It's a gap between what we have and what we want, or between where we are and where we want to be, between what was expected or anticipated and then what the lived experience and reality is. Conflict is simply a gap between two things like that. In my apartment, there were several conflicts at play all at the same time. There was my desire to not have my floor eat my socks, and then there was the present reality. That's a gap. There was a frustration with the housing staff and what I expected of them. And them not doing that in the way that I thought. There was the two stores that I literally purchased all of the magic erasers that they had, and then finding a third store where I could buy more of them. That was a conflict. There was the desire to be settled into the apartment before my classes began, and the reality of having to clean the entire floor. And so we all have conflicts, and they usually happen in layers like that. One particular situation can have lots of conflicts going on, but here's the truth. In life, in every part of life, conflict is unavoidable. You can't have life without it. If you're an introvert or an extrovert, if you're a hermit living all by yourself, or you're living the high life in the middle of a city, it doesn't matter. There will be conflict. So think back to what we talked about last week. We have these innate God-given desires that God gives that to us. We have the ability and the capacity and even the call to imagine what is not yet reality and then work towards it. We have been given unique stories and talents and experiences that are meant to serve the world that God loves. And then we're invited to dream these God-sized and kingdom-shaped dreams, to imagine what it would be like to be a part of bringing beauty or healing into the world, and then to go actually pursue those things. So because we have desires, these good and beautiful things, inherent and innate, there's always going to be a gap. We have a desire for something that isn't there. That's what it's going to be. So that gap is a conflict, and that conflict creates energy. And that's what we're talking about today. Remember, we're in the midst of this 4-part series using some of the work of Donald Miller to talk about how the attributes, the particular elements of a story can teach us how to live a good and meaningful life. And we said at its core, every story is 4 things: a character who wants something and overcomes conflict to get it. We talked the first week about how God makes us on purpose, with purpose. You're endowed with a power and possibility, a mixture of cold and warm, of good and bad, and that we have a calling and an opportunity to do incredible things. We talked last week about what it was to have desires, and then this week we're talking all about conflict. By the way, stories always have conflict. So when we choose to live good stories, I mean, we're all living stories, whether we're intentional about it or not, but when we choose to live good stories, we're choosing to engage in conflict. You can't have a story without conflict. So remember those attributes. We have to have that third part. We have to have a conflict. And stories have to have conflict because there has to be a gap between the desire and the reality. They also have to have it because conflict is what transforms characters. Conflict is what changes us. And it is unavoidable that a compelling, good, and beautiful story will change the character. And so know this, as we talk about engaging in this and being a part of this, you will be changed. So I want you to think for just a minute about what is your relationship with conflict. Like when I say conflict, when you heard that that's what we're talking about today, what came up in you? Was it warm fuzzies? Or was it anxiety? Was it disappointment or guilt or frustration and anger? Did you feel yourself tense up, or did you just want to run away? Does it bring up a particular person's face for you, or a particular place where there's a lot of conflict? Maybe it's a place in your family, in your parents' house, where it feels like there's always argument going on. Or maybe it's a boardroom at work where it's just, there's conflict lives there. Or maybe it's a particular season of your life where you just felt like it was conflict everywhere. Does it feel icky, dirty, gross? Does it feel powerful, necessary, like there's possibility in it? However it makes us feel, I think it's good that we acknowledge that conflict is going to make us feel something. It's an inherent part of life. You can't get rid of it, but it brings up a lot of the feels, and they're not always positive. That's okay. It's an inherent part of life and an integral part of any good story. So thinking about it as something that needs to be mitigated or avoided isn't going to be helpful. What if instead we look at it as a breeding ground of possibility? Instead of assuming that conflict is always going to have negative outcomes, like there's going to be a severing of relationship, there's going to be anger and frustration, there's going to be drama, there's going to be winners and losers. What if instead of assuming that's always what conflict brought, we thought about conflict as the possibility of also providing positive outcomes, like greater clarity and unity and possibility? Almost all artwork comes out of conflict. And when you get artists to really talk about what is behind their work, it often comes out of the angst that exists in conflict, of trying to understand the world or make sense of things that don't make sense. So what if we thought about conflict as sometimes being negative for sure and having negative outcomes, but also having the possibility of positive outcomes? Conflict can do a lot of positive things. One of the things it can do is it can draw us together. People who share an experience or a struggle or a pain bond in ways that other people cannot. People who engage in a challenging project, whether that be like a ropes course or a challenging work project, or who have endured something that happened to them together, are often bonded in a way that they'll never be bonded with other people. That when we've been in the midst of that experience, it bonds us together even if we were total strangers when it started. Or here's another example. Show me two people who have struggled with addiction, and I'll show you two people who can relate to one another more easily than probably many of us will ever understand, because they have that shared struggle. Or show me two people who have wrestled with an unexpected job loss that turned their world upside down and pushed them into a lot of uncertainty. And I'll show you two people who can easily empathize with one another. All of this is conflict. Conflict isn't always fun. I tend to be one who actually leans into conflict because I'd rather work through it than try to avoid it or push it to the outskirts. That doesn't always make other people comfortable. But it's not because it's happy. It's not because I enjoy it. It's because I think it has potential and possibility, and we can use that in positive ways or we can use that in negative ways. And so not all conflict ends up good. Not all of it starts out good. And here's the deal. I don't think God causes conflict or bad things to happen to us. But I do think that God's in the business of redeeming all things. And I do believe that conflict gives us a set of shared experiences that can bind us together. We could unpack that all day. I want to keep moving on. Conflict also initiates the energy that leads to transformation. Transformation for ourselves as the character who's at the center of a subplot of a story. Also a transformation for the world, sharing of beauty. The creation of things like art and reconciliation. And listen, I just want to be clear, I'm not trying to minimize it. Maybe you are walking through some deep, dark, really messed up conflict right now. I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. I'm not trying to say it's all good, or even that you'll look back on this time, this conflict that you're in right now in 10 years, and you'll laugh about it, or you'll see God's redemptive work at it. You may well, or you may not. So I don't want to minimize the pain that comes with real conflict. In fact, I want us to name it. I want us to be real about it. I think we're best served. And we avoid wasting a lot of energy on drama and avoiding conflict if we face it, if we name it, if we compassionately engage with others through conflict And that's part of what I want us to ask to us. That's part of what I want to ask us to do today. Here's another thing that I want to propose to you. What if you could choose some of the conflict that you face in life? Not all of it. 100%. There's things that happen to us. Things fall apart in the world. There's natural disasters. Somebody else does something to us. We come to a place where it feels like there's an impossible choice. Certainly. Also, we're people. We're fallen people. We're broken people. We live in a world where everything is not as it should be. There are things that we cannot control. However, there is a lot of conflict that we can control, that we can choose to engage in or not. There's conflict that we can choose to be a part of, that we can choose to give energy to or not. And so I want us to think about that reality and that dichotomy, that there's some things that we choose and there's some things that we don't. And sometimes we choose them subconsciously. And so let me just unpack that a little bit. Let me be very honest. I speak from an upper middle class Johnson County perspective, and I hope this resonates if that is sort of in your place. We said this last week. We are served with literally thousands of advertisements every single day, and many of those advertisements are intended to create an internal conflict within us, and then encourage us to chase after a particular product or experience to fill that gap that it's created within who we are. So it's like, that's sort of the formula is let me create a conflict within you and then tell you that this product, this service, this experience will fix that gap that you have. That's how the good, innate, God-given desires that we have within us and capacity for desire within us gets rewired to sometimes support consumerism, to sometimes make us chase after things that are not going to give us meaning in our lives. And so a lot of the conflicts that we experience of not having enough of this, of not having sufficient that, or not as much of such and such as so-and-so has, not being able to keep up with the Joneses, a lot of that stuff is conflict that we could just choose to leave behind, to drop. We become so anesthetized with small, meaningless conflicts, what Rob Bell calls death by wallpaper and flooring, that sometimes we have no energy left for meaningful conflict. I have a friend who calls these small things that we let suck our attention that aren't important, energy vampires. I love that language. We have all this going for us, and yet an energy vampire will tell us, like, but focus on what you don't have, what's not going for you, what you could have, what somebody else's projected image of their life is. Maybe you should do that. Here's the deal, friends. I think if we're honest with each other, there's a lot of things that we're chasing. There's a lot of things that we've convinced ourselves that we need, that if we only had that we invest a lot of attention and energy into, that we could just drop right now and everything would be fine. In fact, our lives would be healthier. You know what I mean? I bet you can think of some of those things in your life. And what that does, when we drop that, when we leave those things, when we choose the things that we allow to take up energy and conflict in our lives, is it frees us to then choose those meaningful conflicts in life that will transform us and transform the world, that allow us to live stories that are purpose-filled and intentional and bring about beauty in our lives that are compelling and interesting. When we put the energy vampires to rest, we free ourselves for more beautiful stories and the inherent conflict that they bring. We can engage in those in a meaningful way. So I just want to pause right here and give a completely shameless plug about this small group that we're beginning this week. If all of this sounds a little like iffy to you, like, ooh, this feels like a lot that you're asking of me, or this is a different thing, I want to encourage you to come do a deep dive in this small group. We're going to unpack not only the stories that we've lived and who it is that we are as a character, but what the things that we want are, and then we're going to anticipate some of the conflict. And we're going to talk about what it means that God is working in the midst of conflict and what that looks like. And I want to just invite you to consider being a part of that. Wednesday night, 7 weeks, it starts this week. Come be a part and see if there's more in this for your story and the way that you live. Okay, in shameless plug. The difference between conflict that is an energy vampire and conflict that produces beautiful stories isn't really about the substance of the conflict itself. Instead, it's about the end it's serving. So the difference between meaningless and meaningful conflict is not necessarily the form it takes or the energy it takes. Rather, it's what end it is serving. So if all our conflict is used to make us comfortable, to move us up a proverbial ladder, to keep up with other people's projected reality, then we won't be transformed into the kind of people, the kind of characters that we want to be. But if we spend our energy and invest in conflicts that push us towards meaningful stories, towards kingdom-shaped dreams, towards journeying with others and putting beauty into the world, we'll find that we are changed for the better and that conflict actually can feel redemptive because it transforms who we are and it transforms the world. So I want us to look at a few scriptures that I think point exactly to this truth, to the same idea. Let's begin with Romans 5 that we read at the beginning of this message. I love this vision that Paul says, not only that we cannot avoid our conflict or our afflictions, as he says, our struggles, but that we can actually boast in them. I mean, when was the last time that you boasted in a struggle that you had? So this is what he says, we boast in our afflictions. Why do we do that? Like, it's not just because we're masochists who enjoy pain. It's not because we want everybody to look at us and feel sorry for us. No, we boast because we know that affliction produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame. What a beautiful image that is. Do you see what Paul's talking about? This conflict that we engage in will transform us if we engage it, if we go through it, if we trust God in the midst of it. We will be changed. We will be people who are filled with hope, and that will change who we are, and we can change the world through it. So we boast in the struggles. We don't avoid them. We said last week, right? Paul is somebody who knew struggle. He knew affliction. We read from Ephesians. And at the beginning of that chapter, he says, I'm literally a prisoner in chains, because he was a character. He most definitely was a character who had a transformation and then came out with this one goal, this one clear purpose. He had this one thing that he wanted, and he experienced all kinds of conflict as he went on the way. So he was in prison. There were external conflicts like that. He also had internal conflicts. And this is interesting to me. From 2 Corinthians 12, verses 9 and 10, he says that he had a thorn in his side, and scholars argue all about what that means, and we won't get into that. I don't really know. But the point is, he had some internal conflict, some internal struggle. And it says that he earnestly prayed day after day to God to take it away. But God said this, my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made perfect in your weakness. And so this is what Paul says. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I'm content with my weaknesses, with insults, with hardship and persecution and calamity for the sake of Christ. For wherever I am weak, then I am strong. Wherever that conflict, wherever that gap exists, there Christ is, there God is working. And because of that, my very weakness becomes a strength, because it's Christ at work in who I am. That's what he's saying. That's what this week is all about. What if the conflicts that we had in life were worth boasting about? Notice Paul doesn't get a ticket to the easy life. He not only doesn't get a get out of jail free card, he ends up going to jail. He goes from having money and power and relevance to being abused and imprisoned, and eventually will cost him his life. His lifetime earning potential doesn't go up. His lifetime comfort quotient doesn't go up. After his conversion, none of that happens, but this is what does happen. He has a sense of purpose. He has a peace. And he even has a joy that most of us could scarcely touch. That's the power of conflict working in our lives. James 1, 2 through 4 shares the same idea. My brothers and sisters, whenever you face various trials, consider it all joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance complete its work in you, so that you may be complete and whole, lacking in nothing. So friends, here are my hopes for today. I hope you understand that conflict is unavoidable and that we shouldn't be afraid of it. It's a gap between what is and what could be, and it produces energy that we can use for harm or for health. I also hope you know that to a certain extent, we get to choose our conflicts. And part of the challenge of this series is to choose good stories, to choose meaningful conflict, and to put our energy into those purposeful things. We can't always choose it, not every time, but when we put our energy towards things that matter, we find that we are transformed by it. And the scriptures attest to this over and over, and perhaps we can even find goodness and joy through it. Usually the difference between conflict that feels meaningless and, something that is meaning-producing, that is transformative in a positive way, is the difference between conflict that feels meaningless and something that is meaningless and something that is meaning-producing, that is transformative in a positive way. Usually the difference between conflict that feels meaningless and something that is meaningless and something that is meaning-producing, that is transformative in a positive way, is about the end to which it's going. Another way to say that in terms of story is that it's about the narrative structure. It's about living a good story, having purpose and goals and working towards them. Without those things, conflict just feels icky and painful, but with them, it has great purpose. So I want to read this. This is from Donald Miller, from a resource that he has that we'll actually be using for that small group that I, again, shamelessly want to invite you to be a part of. He says this: conflict hurts the most when it doesn't have a narrative context. The apostles suffered for Jesus because they loved him and they wanted to participate in what he was doing. With the right narrative, you'll quit your job, swim the English Channel, fast for a month, face your fears, and fight the enemy. Conflict makes life worth living. Without it, we'd be bored. There is nothing so miserable as enduring pain without a narrative context. Put me on a mountain and point me towards the summit, and suddenly being pelted with rain and ice feels like an exhilarating challenge. But if you sit me on a couch and throw ice chunks at me, the pain is much less satisfying. The sad truth is that life is full of pain and struggle with or without a worthy ambition. And so if we're sitting on the proverbial couch, we're taking the pain without a worthwhile context. That sounds like a miserable life. We need to give our conflict a narrative context in order to redeem it. And then this is the last line. If all that has sounded like a bunch of jargon, just hear this. We are going to experience conflict whether we're living a good story or not. We might as well have a narrative context so that the pain makes sense and contributes to a life of meaning. So remember that apartment I was, and maybe am still a little bit pretty angry about the floor that I cleaned. There's a little bit of bitterness. We can talk about it sometime if you want. But it reminds me of a different time where I was working on a very similar floor. I was on a mission trip. I was a leader with several students, and we went to a church that had been flooded, and they had pulled out the sheetrock up to a certain height in most of the church, and we came in to help do some demolition, and we were removing the floor, a very similar type of floor to what I had in my apartment. And I don't know what it was. Normally these floors should come up early. It should come up easy. I don't know if it's because of the flooding, because of how it was installed. I don't know what the case is. But it was so hard to pull up. And so I think for 8 hours that day, in humid, ridiculous heat with no air movement and no air conditioning, we pulled up that floor, again, in backbreaking, excruciating work. We were all drenched in sweat by 10 in the morning, and it only got worse from there. But we pulled this up tile by tile by tile by tile. And I think most of us worked through our lunch, and we finally had to be dragged off the work site, sore and aching as our bodies were at the end of the day. I still remember that experience, and I remember it so fondly. And I think those students do too. So what's the difference between being on my hands and knees in a hot apartment by myself and being in this church that had been flooded out and pulling up the tiles? The difference is the narrative context. We were there telling a good story. We were serving a community that was hurting. And listen, my apartment needed to be cleaned. It's not like I'm shaming myself or it's a bad story. There's stuff that needs to get done, and so we do it in life. But when we're a part of a grander narrative, of a transformative tale, when we allow ourselves to be changed and transformed, all of a sudden that conflict, that difficulty, that struggle, it has deeper meaning. It has deeper purpose. And it changes the whole experience of the conflict. So what's that look like in your life? What's the conflict that you can let go of? And what's the conflict that you can take on that will give your character transformation and your life meaning and purpose? Let's take a few moments for reflection.